Half a minute. That is all it takes for the body to surrender, yet in those 30 seconds, the severed head does not instantly fall silent. Eyes blink, lips tremble, a tongue may form the ghost of a word, prayers that no breath can carry. Witnesses speak of faces still aware, suspended between life and oblivion. Now place yourself on Tower Green, May 19th, 1536. The air is cool, the crowd restless, the scaffold built low. Anne Boleyn kneels, not upon a block but upright, waiting for the glint of foreign steel. Her death is remembered as swift, but the strike was only the final act in a theatre of power. The humiliation began long before the sword, and it was designed not only to end her life, but to erase it. What came before made the blade inevitable. 17 days. That is all Anne Boleyn had between her arrest and her death. The walls of the tower that had once echoed her triumph now closed around her, with suffocating inevitability. 3 years earlier she had processed through London as queen, a coronation marked with pageantry and guilt. Now, in those same chambers, she awaited judgment, stripped of crown, stripped of certainty, reduced to a prisoner under suspicion of treason, incest, and adultery. Henry VIII's objective was never simple execution. Death alone could not undo a queen who had changed the kingdom's faith, who had given him a daughter, who had been the axis of scandal and reform. He required deletion of reputation, of lineage, of memory, so the charges swelled with grotesque invention. 5 men named, including her own brother. Whispered trysts and imagined conspiracies painted her as a seductress conspiring against the throne. It was theatre dressed as justice, and the audience was a kingdom. Inside the tower, Anne's words veered between defiance and dark wit. She joked about her slender neck as though its delicacy might make the headsman's work easier. At other times her speech fractured, disjointed, drifting into prayers and fragments of laughter that unsettled even her attendants. These were not the ravings of a madwoman, but the coping strategies of a mind being crushed by suspense. Dissociation became her final armour. The cruelty was sharpened by delay. Day after day she was prepared for death, only to be told she must wait. The court had summoned a French executioner, famed for his sword, not the clumsy axe. To the public this was spun as mercy. Yet mercy, when postponed, becomes torment. Each hour stretched her nerves thinner, each postponement another twist of the blade before it ever fell, and so the cage tightened. But why summon a foreign swordsman at all? What message was encoded in that choice, and what performance did Henry intend it to deliver? On the final night, sleep abandoned her. Anne Boleyn remained in the tower, restless, her mind gnawed by the approaching certainty of steel. At 2 a.m. she received the sacrament, kneeling in fragile devotion. Hours passed on the cold stones, her body locked in prayer while her thoughts ricocheted between dread and surrender. By dawn she had endured nearly 24 hours without rest, her strength unravelling, her composure thinning like thread about to snap. Her ladies saw laughter escape her lips, incongruous, almost wild. Some later claimed it was serenity, that she faced death with calm, but the truth rang differently, the fractured laughter of exhaustion, of nerves pulled to breaking point. It was not peace, but collapse, masked in humour that only deepened the unease of those forced to watch her decline. The torment lay not merely in what awaited, but in the shifting hour of its arrival. Twice she was told the end would come, twice it was deferred. Courtiers whispered of arrangements, of a foreign executioner yet to be made ready. Each postponement was another sanctioned cruelty, a strategy of uncertainty designed to hollow her from within. She lived, breath by ragged breath, not knowing which sunrise would be her last. When morning finally broke, Anne was led from her chambers. The passage through the tower was short, yet endless in its wait. Once she had walked corridors as queen, every gaze bent toward her in reverence. Now, as she moved toward her fate, eyes turned away, courtiers shrinking into silence, unwilling to acknowledge what they were complicit in. The corridors themselves seemed to close upon her, narrow, airless, pressing her toward the scaffold. And there, at Tower Green, another shock awaited. The stage was not lofty, not grand. It was a scaffold barely 3 feet high, designed not for dignity but for exposure. Why was a queen placed so low before the crowd? What spectacle did this architecture intend to create? The scaffold rose only 3 feet from the earth. It was not a platform of grandeur but of deliberate smallness. forcing Anne Boleyn's body into the crowd's line of sight. There was no height to lend majesty, no elevation to suggest untouchable sovereignty. Instead, the architecture of death pressed her downward, keeping her close, making her suffering a communal act of witness. The morning carried the hum of expectancy, more carnival than solemn rite. Londoners thronged to the Tower as if to a spectacle, murmurs rising like a marketplace. Historians would later soften the atmosphere into something grave, something reverent, but witnesses knew otherwise. It was performance, and every detail, the hour, the scaffold, the crowd was calibrated to remind ambitious subjects, especially women, of the fate that awaited those who overreached. Anne stood with composed fragility, required to speak before the executioner raised his hand. Yet her words were shackled as surely as her body. Tradition demanded submission without confession, gratitude to the king without a flicker of defiance. She could not protest her innocence nor curse the husband who had orchestrated her ruin. To have done so would have endangered her attendants, even her daughter. So she complied with ritual, praising Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord. It was survival calculus, though survival itself had been ruled out. The king did not attend. His absence thundered louder than presence. Henry remained at a distance, already casting his gaze toward Jane Seymour, the next queen in waiting. The scaffold, then, was not for him. It was for the people, a stage of statecraft where death was proof of power and silence became a royal decree. And then the atmosphere shifted. A figure stepped forward, the swordsman from Calais, summoned across the channel at great expense. He bowed, his blade concealed. One stroke, they whispered, a clean cut, a foreign efficiency unlike the clumsy axe. But what did that single, perfect stroke conceal? What terror lingered in the pause before it fell? The blindfold was drawn not as kindness, but as control. Anne Boleyn would not see the blade, nor could her final gaze meet the crowd. She knelt upright, her head never resting upon a block. This was the French method, swift, clinical, unnervingly intimate. Stillness was demanded of her. Any movement, any flinch, could transform precision into horror. So she fixed her body in place, waiting in darkness. The swordsman moved with calculated deception. He called for his assistant to fetch the weapon, distracting her ears, guiding her focus away from the moment. The sword was already in his hand. Witnesses held their breath, watching the queen strain to locate sounds she could not see. Time dilated in the hush, each heartbeat a hammer against the void. Then the blade arced. A single, perfect stroke. It severed flesh and sinew in less than a second, the steel singing as it cut through the morning air. The head toppled, the body collapsed. Yet the silence that followed was more terrible than the strike itself. Those who watched swore they saw her lips tremble after the fall, shaping words no voice could carry. Some claimed her eyes flickered, as if still seeking light. Muscles twitched, features convulsed. Physicians would later call it reflex, the body's last sparks misfiring in the absence of command. But for the witnesses, it seemed more 30 seconds of awareness, half a minute of unbearable mystery. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some recoiling, others staring in horrified fascination. The executioner lifted the head, dark hair spilling over his hands, and for a moment the queen who had once worn a crown was reduced to an object displayed. The strike was swift. Yes, but swiftness was not mercy. It was efficiency, the kind a king demanded. And even then her humiliation was not finished. For what becomes of a queen's body when no coffin waits? When the sword was sheathed, the crowd dispersed, leaving behind not ceremony but a void. No coffin stood ready for the fallen queen. Instead, her attendants, shaking, weeping, dazed, were forced to improvise. They searched frantically for a container and found only an old arrow chest, rough wood splintering at the seams. Into this makeshift box they placed her remains, queenly dignity reduced to a hurried bundle. Beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, without inscription, she was lowered into earth, no monument, no marker, only silence pressing down on stone. The war on Anne Boleyn's memory began at once. Portraits vanished, her emblems scraped away from walls and tapestries. Courtiers, who had once bowed, now taught their tongues to forget her name. The woman who had altered England's religion, who had reigned at Henry's side, was to be erased as though she had never been. Oblivion, not remembrance, was the king's true gift. For those closest to her, the trauma lingered. Her ladies, forced to collect the fragments of their mistress, carried the weight in nightmares. One sought refuge in a convent, fleeing a court that demanded silence over grief. Others lived haunted by that scaffold, the sound of steel cleaving through morning air. Her daughter was not spared. Elizabeth, once the bright hope of the Tudor line, was declared illegitimate. Her household dismantled, her status stripped. She became collateral in her mother's destruction. The erasure of Anne was not only personal, it was generational. Even the child's identity became a weapon in Henry's hands. Anne's body was hidden, her image destroyed, her legacy strangled before it could breathe. Yet power abhors a vacuum. With one queen obliterated, another was waiting, and the speed of that replacement revealed how ruthlessly the court could turn the page. But who rewrites the story when memory itself is buried? And how quickly can a kingdom forget? Anne Boleyn's fall was not just personal tragedy. It was statecraft, executed with precision. Within days of her death, poets who had once sung her praises bent their pens toward Jane Seymour. Records were edited, language reshaped, memory scrubbed until the queen who had altered England's course seemed a dangerous aberration rather than a sovereign partner. The speed was dizzying. The narrative of her mercy spread quickly. Henry had summoned a foreign swordsman, they said, so her end would be swift. This became his shield, proof of benevolence in the very moment of annihilation. The machinery did not pause. Security doubled around the tower. Bells tolled not for mourning but authority, reinforcing the spectacle as lesson. The timing itself was calculated. A mid-morning execution, when London streets surged with labourers, ensured the crowd swelled. Thousands witnessed what power required them to see. Anne had not died alone. The men accused with her friends, servants, her own brother were executed first. Their deaths cemented the narrative of her guilt, building inevitability around her fate. By the time she mounted the scaffold, the story was already written, and her body was its punctuation mark. Even the ground beneath her feet would not preserve her. Tower Green became a place of ambiguity. Later generations argued over where exactly she fell, where precisely she was buried. This uncertainty was not accident, but consequence. The erasure of detail mirrored the erasure of her person. What remains when truth itself is engineered, when memory bends to the state? Henry did not linger in grief. 11 days later, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, and within weeks they were married. The court pivoted with terrifying efficiency, as if a queen had not just been obliterated. Continuity was power's camouflage. And so the blade's echo carried forward not as lament but as precedent. Strip away the spectacle, and what remains is darker than blood, a story sculpted to serve authority, sharpened against those who might resist. But if truth can be rewritten, where does the blade stop cutting? Anne Boleyn's death was not only the fall of a queen, it was the triumph of narrative control. Her trial, her confinement, her execution, all were stages in a psychological campaign meant to strip her not just of life but of meaning. Isolation fractured her will, exhaustion blurred her defences. Shifting rumours and manipulated silences carved away her humanity until the moment of the strike seemed almost inevitable. The true weapon was not the sword but the story. Anne was transformed from reformer to traitor, from queen to discarded body in an arrow chest, by the machinery of propaganda. Agony became theatre, her erasure a warning engraved into the minds of courtiers and subjects alike. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. That machinery did not vanish with her burial. It persisted, echoing through history, shaping how monarchs ruled and how subjects obeyed. Her execution was a precedent, a template for power cloaked in ritual, disguised as justice, and it reaches forward still. For what is more chilling than the blade itself? The fact that truth can be cut, rewritten, and wielded as weapon. The sword fell once, but the story kept cutting through memory, through history, through us. Anne's final silence lingers not in the ground beneath the tower, but in the reminder that power's sharpest edge is not steel, it is narrative, and it is always waiting to be used again.